Welcome back, friends. Welcome to the Thursday, March the 10th edition of our video podcast. Steve Autrey at Denver United Methodist Church, Paul Thompson, Huntersville United Methodist Church. Yesterday, we had a kind of a wide-ranging conversation a little bit, but we really want to focus in today on a passage from Genesis chapter 15 that is really critical to our understanding of how God works in the world in terms of covenant making and the ways that we begin to understand that our relationship with God is not based on how we perform.
Right.
It is simply based on who God is.
And we left it yesterday with this question of Abram, who's following God. God comes back to re-up the promise, and Abram goes, I hear you, yet I don't see it. And that's a place we can often find ourselves. I hear you, God, yet I need to see something. I need to experience something.
So one of the fascinating things for me about this passage is that it is representative of what's called a suzerainty treaty. A suzerainty treaty is different.
You drag water on earth? Look at the big brain on Paul over here. I'm impressed.
You should be. A suzerainty treaty was a treaty in which someone entered into, but not of their own power. Abram had no power in this relationship. The power rests in God. And what God is saying to Abram here, in essence, as he makes a promise, Abram, look, I am going to give you that offspring. I am going to bless your offspring with this land in a perpetual covenant agreement forever. And so then this passage we see is this scene in which God tells Abram to cut the animals in two, to lay them over against one another, and it is the presence of God in the smoking pot.
Not a PETA-friendly scene.
Not a friendly scene. This would be, two animals literally cut open, laying beside each other, and the presence of God passes through the middle of them. And the passing of God through the middle of those is in essence saying, let this be to me. Let what has happened to these animals be to me if I do not fulfill the obligation of my promise.
May I be as so if I fail to uphold my end of the bargain.
Right. And so this is a fascinating passage in which Abram, at this point, his name has not been changed to Abraham, experiences that presence of God and recognizes that this is the type of God that he's dealing with. A God who promises and comes through and says, and this is how far I will go to show you that I will follow this promise.
Not only am I going to make this happen, I'm going to carry the weight of responsibility for it. Abram, you come with me, and I will be faithful. It's interesting, but right before that, God kind of he takes Abram outside and says, "Look at all those stars. You will have heirs." And remember, we talked yesterday how Abram started out in old age. Well, he's well beyond, he and his wife, well beyond the time when they should have children. And so he's scratching his head at this. And God said to me, I want you to step into this place that only faith can take you.
That's the only qualification that Abram had. The only qualification, Abram was not, some upstanding person, morally better than anyone else. What he did have is a sense that he trusted God, and he moved when God said move, and he held on to the promise.
And the scripture says he looked and believed, and God accounted that as righteousness. So so that's a hard place to be able to say, God, I'm not seeing it, I'm not feeling it, but I'm still going to believe it.
And that's what the whole journey of Lent, the whole journey of faith is about, is to believe that even Abram knew that he was going to face death, but that God, even in death, God's promises are trustworthy and true. And the promises that we received as people of faith are grounded in who God is, not in my performance.
And God always calls us to that place where we can't depend upon external evidence. Where we have to step towards faith. I encounter so many people who want to get down the weeds and say this proves this or this proves that. And the thing is, well, if you could prove everything, then you wouldn't need faith to believe it.
as I always said, if we could understand God, God wouldn't be God. This is a mystery in which we do not always understand, but we are always called to follow in faith and trust.
And that promise is concrete. It is, hey, I will give you this land. I will give you offspring. There will be things that you are able to count and see and know, because I am in the world and I am with you. And sometimes we forget that there are signs, even in the here and now, especially in the here and now, that God is at work.
So one of the real tenets of the geopolitical world right now is that Israel exists where it exists because of this promise made to Abram that many years ago. So much of the world's politics is caught up in the fact that we still believe this promise, and the people called Israel still believe this promise. So here we have probably...
And what's fascinating about that to me is Israel was more or less wiped off the face of the earth as a political entity in 70 AD. So almost 2,000 years ago. And yet existed for 1,900 years without land. Existed as an idea, as a faith, as a concept. I don't know of a people anywhere that if you dispossess them of their land, that they would continue their identity apart from land.
And in 1946, 47, that United Nations...
48.
48. So
you may know about these treaties, but...
So 1948, Israel, through a United Nations move, was allowed to reform as a nation. And
as a political entity.
Yeah, as a political entity. So these promises that God makes, oftentimes they test our patience. We don't always see how God works, but we look back and we see the evidence that God has been faithful.
And ultimately, though, I think what is the key to this passage is that fact that Abram isn't asked to walk with God through the covenant ritual. God's faithfulness, it comes out of God's own willingness to enter into that relationship with us. And God's the one who always holds up. God's the one who doesn't fail. God's the one who can be counted on. We all know that as human beings, we have a lot of frailty and we all make mistakes. Part of our journey through Lent is dealing with our mistakes, our failures, and asking God to reconstitute us once again into the person that God calls us to be. But this is why we can count on the promises God makes, because God is the one who backs them up, not us, but God. Not human frailty, but divine love and loyalty. One of the themes you'll see throughout the Old Testament is the phrase that repeats over and over again, especially in the Psalms, is God's steadfast love endures forever. And that is, the idea there is Hesed. It's God is the one who provides. God is the one who loves. God is the one who continues. And in a world that's upside down, certainly right now, and throughout most of the history of the world, it's been turmoil and wars and rumors of wars, but yet God's steadfast love endures forever. And that's something we can always count on, even in and especially in uncertain times.
So as we make the move toward Sunday, tomorrow we'll be looking at a fascinating passage from Luke chapter 13, in which Jesus talks about this land, or at least part of this land, Jerusalem. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks for your time today. And we'll be back looking at Luke chapter 13, verses 31 to 35 tomorrow. Hope you'll join us.
Thank you.